Welcome everyone to the world famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Andrew Medina. I am member number 1212, and I'm so glad to be your host for the evening. We got another great program coming at you tonight. I'm joined by the one and only Brett Eldrige to talk about his adventures diving the Britannic. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Brett, welcome to the Adventurers Club. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, very much appreciated.
Is it your first time at the club?
No, actually I was here almost exactly a year ago when Men's Bound was here.
Wow, that was a great program.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I had literally gotten back from Antarctica 2 days before that event, so it was really timely. But yeah, so not my first time.
Do you know him? Because you're both Explorers Club member guys, right?
Yeah, we both are. I don't know him personally. Obviously, I've run across him in a few different things, but I don't know him as like a friend. But obviously know who he is.
Nice. Well, all right. So let's talk a little bit about you before we get stuck in to the meat of this thing. So you are an extraordinary diver. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I've been diving for a very long time, but I got into what's called technical diving, which is essentially, there's many different definitions, but I define it as basically something that requires mandatory decompression. So I got into technical diving quite some time ago and kind of fell into wreck diving. I'm passionate about wrecks because I like history.
Okay.
So I've been doing kind of technical wreck diving for 7 to 8 years. I do consider myself an explorer. We've been, with some friends, we've been finding new wrecks here in Southern California.
Oh yeah? Like what?
We found airplanes, we found Bearcats, we found TBM Avengers, we found P-38s. Some wrecks, shipwrecks, and we try to identify them, and that's usually most of the hard work. We found a helicopter as well, so do quite a bit of exploration here, and then travel all over the world and mainly do diving. Probably 95% of my dives are wreck dives.
Okay, and then I remember. So real quick, I just wanted to point out, like you are a member of the Explorers Club.
Yeah, I joined the Explorers Club in 2021. So about 3 years now. And
for the folks who don't know, the Explorers Club is our affiliate organization. We love them despite the fact they're from New York. We don't hold it against them. So they're all great, I'm sure. But one thing that I think we need to touch on is you're licensed in technical rebreathing, or you're a technical rebreather.
Yeah, so I dive a rebreather without going into too much detail. Rebreathers become very much more efficient than regular, what we call open circuit scuba, the deeper you go.
And why is that?
Basically because you're recirculating the gas, so it makes it more efficient. Like every 33 feet down, you breathe another atmosphere of gas. So if you're at, let's just say 200 feet, which is 6 atmospheres, you're breathing 7 times the volume of gas you breathe on the surface on regular scuba.
Gotcha.
So, every time you take a breath, you're breathing 7 times that volume, and you can only fit so much gas inside regular scuba tanks.
Right.
A rebreather kind of gets rid of that limitation for the most part. So it's a way more efficient way to do deeper diving.
Okay. And so, for deeper diving, I know that there's also elements of, you have to mix nitrogen in there every so often, or other sort of gases as well in order to kind of maintain certain levels. So how does that work with a rebreather versus regular scuba tanks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you actually mix in stuff to get rid of nitrogen, because nitrogen gives you the narcosis, which is kind of like having a couple martinis, I guess, which is generally not a good idea when you're diving. So you mix in helium, which is an inert gas, and that gets rid of nitrogen.
Gotcha.
And then when you get below, call it just 200-ish feet, you have to start getting rid of oxygen because it becomes toxic to your system below 200 feet. So then you have to mix in even more helium. And the way it works in a rebreather is there's basically 2 small tanks. One is pure oxygen, and that basically is just used to replenish what your body metabolizes. And then the other one is what they call a diluent, and it dilutes the oxygen. You can't breathe pure oxygen below 20 feet. Okay. So there's the diluent that has that helium mixture in it, and then the pure oxygen.
Interesting. And so, how important is that for diving wrecks like the Britannic?
We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Britannic, but nowadays, and the people who dove it originally and how they did that, but nowadays, I don't know anybody who would dive the Britannic without a rebreather. I mean, it's possible, but you're going to be very, very, very limited on the amount of time you spend on the wreck.
Okay.
And for me personally, I like the flexibility of diving with a rebreather. There's a lot of things that go with that, but it's a way more, like I said, efficient way to do it, and in my opinion, a safer way to dive like really deep wrecks like the Britannic.
Gotcha. Okay, so on screen right now we have a list of some of your greatest hits, some of the wrecks you've dove. So of these wrecks, which one would you say was like the most technical dive, and which one is the most fun for you?
The most technical is definitely the Britannic. I mean, we'll talk about why that is, but it's a very, very technical dive. For me, it's the pinnacle of wreck diving.
Really?
It's not that there's not a bigger wreck. There's a couple that are bigger, but just given the depth and the history of the wreck, and the preparation you need to do and the conditions you dive it in, it is the pinnacle, in my opinion. The funnest one, that's probably the next one.
All right. All right. Okay. What's the next one?
I just got back from the Solomon Islands, actually. I was there for about 2 weeks diving the World War II wrecks in the Solomons, and that was fantastic. So I've got a bunch of stuff lined up for the rest of the year as well.
Okay. And then I just want to give your website a shout out before we get too deep into it. Wrecked in my Revo?
Revo. The Revo is the brand of rebreather I use. It's called a Revo.
Okay.
So my website is Wrecked in My Revo. I publish all the stuff I do there, or almost all of it. I take a lot of photographs. I just did a trip report on the Solomons. It talks about how I got there. If you like adventure, it's pretty much all about adventure and diving and wrecks. There's no fee or anything. You could just go and look at it, or you can subscribe and get updates when I publish.
And so you need not appear immodest. Folks, I would go to the website and I would subscribe to it. There's a lot of amazing stories in there, and the quality of writing is just incredible. So highly, highly recommend that. Yeah, of course. So let's talk about the Britannic.
Okay.
What was it, first of all?
So the Britannic was basically the third in a series of ships. Built by White Star Line. There was first the Olympic. Usually they call a class of ships by the first ship made in it, so these are all Olympic class ships.
Okay. But there was a more famous one.
Yeah, so after the Olympic was actually in operation for quite some time, and then the Olympic was scrapped actually later on in life, but it served as a luxury liner for quite some time. The second one was the Titanic. Of course, I'm assuming everybody in the room knows the story of the Titanic. It was produced a couple years after the Olympic and hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage.
It's the younger siblings. The burnouts always get remembered.
Yeah, it's the middle kid, right? That troublesome middle kid. And then the third was the Britannic. And the Britannic was produced, obviously, after the Titanic. There's something unique in this picture. I don't know if you'll recognize it or not, but there's actually a couple of unique things. One is the livery, or the painting color. Sure. You can see it's painted white with crosses on it. It was used as a hospital ship. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
And there's also, if you look kind of near the fourth smokestack back, there's these big, huge davits. Davits are things that lower lifeboats into the water. And those were a result of the accident or incident on the Titanic. So the Britannic was the third ship. Sometimes they call it the forgotten sister ship because a lot of people, maybe not in this room, but in general, don't know about the Britannic.
It's like a real family. The youngest child gets forgotten, and then everyone remembers the middle kid. Okay, so what was the history of the Britannic's voyage before the sixth voyage?
Yeah, so like I said, the Britannic started out, I mean, the goal was to make a luxury liner, right? Just like the other ones. And this was during World War I. And the British government basically requisitioned the Britannic and said, hey, we need to use this ship as a hospital ship. So they requisitioned it. And before it was done outfitting, so they hadn't put all the grand staterooms in there, the famous spiral staircases in there, but they hadn't put all the other luxury fittings for a luxury liner. So they basically outfitted it as a hospital ship. They put hospital beds in, they put operating rooms, they put doctor's quarters, they put all the things that you would expect on a hospital ship. And they would sail from the UK down through the waters and then up through the Aegean to a place called Mudros, where they would pick up wounded soldiers and Navy people, and then they would make the return voyage back to England with the wounded people. It did 3 of these voyages successfully, and then the British government said, okay, we're done with our work with this. You guys can have it back. You can re-outfit it as a luxury liner and start running luxury lines back and forth on the Atlantic. and then promptly 2 months later said, oops, we made a mistake and we need it back. So they basically, they obviously hadn't completely retrofitted it back as a luxury liner. And so they got it back. And then in 1916, near the end of the year, it made its last and sixth fatal voyage.
Okay.
Basically what happened was it left England, went down to Italy, went through the canals, as you can see, went across the ocean, and then kind of was going up through the Aegean, and it was pretty close to this island called Kea, which is right off of Athens for the most part. And it, we'll talk about kind of like how it happened, but basically it...
Real quick, what was its objective? Like, what was it doing?
It was doing the same thing. It was going to, so this is a little bit important, but it was on its way to go pick up more people.
Okay.
So it didn't have a full complement of sick people, right? It was, nurses and doctors and, people working the ship. There's, a bunch of what they call firemen. Firemen don't put out fires on big ships like this. They basically take coal and build the fires to power the steam to power the boat. Anyway, there's firemen on board, there's captains, there's mates and cooks and all that other stuff, but no hospital passengers.
So relatively small crew.
Yeah, it was, I don't know, like maybe 500 people or something on that order.
That explains a lot.
Well, not compared to what it could be with all the people,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So it was on its way to go pick up, on its sixth time, all these wounded people, and it was passing through this channel. We'll get a picture of that channel in a little bit, but it was passing through this channel when there was an explosion on the starboard side. And we'll talk about how it sank, but that caused the ship eventually to sink.
Okay.
This is kind of a drawing of the Britannic. She sits on her starboard side.
That's the right side.
Yeah, sorry for the people in the audience who aren't boat people. Starboard is right, port is left. So she sits on her starboard side. Like I said, she's in between Athens and Kea. We'll talk about how you get there in just a minute. The boat itself is about 900 feet long. One of the most amazing things to me about the Britannic, having dove it, is that it is, for a wreck that's, sank in 1916, it's very old, and it's almost completely intact, which is extremely rare. Part of the reason for that, at least what I've been told by the locals in Greece, is that the way she sits is that her keel faces the current. So the current comes up and over the keel, protecting basically her deck where all the cranes are and bridge and equipment and all the other stuff. So it's kind of naturally protected from all the currents. Some of the key features we'll talk about in a minute are the bow, the big crack towards the bow we'll talk about.
Okay.
The propellers are very, very cool. And then those big davits, we'll talk about those as well.
Love it.
So let's talk about how she sank.
Do lights.
Basically, like I said, there was an explosion on her starboard side between some of the holds. And
The inside or the outside?
outside. The explosion was not from within. It was on the outside.
Okay.
I have a slide about how that happened. There was a bunch of mystery and debate about that we'll talk about in just a minute. But there was an explosion in the side. Now, keep in mind that after the Titanic had its accident, they had reinforced the Britannic.
Okay.
So basically, they had put in a double wall hull. They had added extra bulkheads. They had taken all these precautions in order to make sure that the Britannic didn't sink.
They have the davits. Like
Those big, huge lifeboat davits. Yeah, those. The purpose of those was to get lifeboats in the water faster,
Sure.
And more efficiently and more effectively than the smaller ones they had on the Titanic and the Olympic. So, part of the problem on the Titanic is, one, they didn't have enough lifeboats, so they ended up having, I think, 48 lifeboats on the Britannic from memory. And then they had these kind of small cranes that took forever to get the lifeboats in and out of the water. So they built these huge davits, had more lifeboats. They took a bunch of precautions. But there was an explosion on the starboard side near the bow. And, of course, the front compartments started to flood. And the flooding got worse and worse and worse. And then eventually there was about 7 compartments that had flooded. Now, the thing about that is it should have been able to withstand 7 compartments being flooded, but it didn't.
But it didn't.
It did not. We'll talk about why that sank in just a minute.
Very interesting.
So we have an artist's rendition. These are not my drawings. You can go to the next slide, maybe. So basically at, I can't see the exact writing, but 8:12 in the morning is when the explosion occurred. And then, like I said, she quickly started to take on water. And her bow, because it was in the bow, her bow started to sink.
Okay.
Now, the captain had said, very specifically, do not put the lifeboats in the water.
Okay.
Get them ready,
I see.
but do not put the lifeboats in the water.
Because she should be able to survive.
Well, he was still trying to figure out what to do with the ship.
Okay.
And he wasn't ready to abandon ship yet. So he said, get it ready, but don't put lifeboats in the water. And if you know anything about ships, the ship started to sink by the bow. So when a ship starts sinking by the bow, what happens in the stern?
It goes up.
Okay, and what's at the stern?
The propellers and the...
Yes, there's propellers in the stern. In fact, there's 3 really big ones. I have pictures of those. There's 3 really big ones on the Britannic.
Okay.
So tragically, there was 2 lifeboats that I guess you could say ignored the captain's orders. And they got a little, anxious, and they lowered 2 lifeboats into the water as the Britannic's bow was sinking. Basically, tragically, 2 lifeboats full of people ran straight into the props, and you can imagine what happened.
Yes, I can.
So that happened. Meanwhile, the ship continues to sink and continues to get her compartments flooded. What happened, what they've worked out over time, basically, is that, and this goes back to the question of, okay, if she was able to withstand, 7 compartments being flooded, and that's what happened, how did she actually sink?
Right.
So remember, she's sinking by the bow, and she's kind of listing to the starboard, because that's where the explosion was, so she starts listing to the starboard. And on any big luxury liner ship, what do you have in all the compartments where people live?
Portholes.
Portholes. Normally, during a transit like this, portholes would be closed because you're transiting and, anything can happen, right? Especially during wartime. Basically, the chief surgeon had said, open up the portholes because we want to get some fresh air in the ship before we go and pick up all the wounded soldiers, and so let's air out the ship. The captain apparently said, we shouldn't do that, but the doctor kind of won that argument, and so the portholes were open. So as she started listing towards her starboard side, and as the bow started going down, water started flooding into those portholes and quickly flooding all the cabins. So at that point, the captain did order an abandoned ship. They put all the lifeboats in the water, and everybody that wasn't in the first 2 lifeboats lived. Captain was like the last person off the ship. He basically got off the ship as the bridge was being filled with water. So he literally stayed until the end.
Right, so he stepped up.
Yeah. He actually, what he tried to do is beach the wreck. I mean, he was going towards Kea. He saw Kea in the distance and thought, okay, the safest thing to do is for me to beach this ship so that people can get off of it and they won't drown. He kind of realized that was not going to happen just given the rate at which it was sinking. So he then ordered the abandoned ship, got everybody off the ship, and then got himself off the ship as well. So next slide.
And real quick, how long did it take?
Well, we're going to get right there.
Okay, cool.
So
Right
the ship is going down, and now remember that the depth of the water in that location is, call it 385, 390 feet, and the ship is, call it 900 feet long. So she goes down, she hits bow first, crumples to the starboard side, and then sinks and ends up on her starboard side, and there's a big crack in the bow you'll see some photos of in a little bit. Start to finish, 55 minutes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I don't know the exact time on the Titanic. I know there's some people in the room who have done some stuff on the Titanic. I think it was on the order of 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah.
Just to give you kind of a sense of time. 55 minutes.
55 minutes. And only about 380 feet deep.
Only.
As opposed to the Titanic, which is 12,500 feet deep.
Yes, yeah. I mean, relative to the Titanic, yes, it's shallow. Relative to diving, it's a little deep. But yes, it's called 400 feet of water.
The divers are laughing at me in the audience.
Yeah, it's all relative, right? Yeah, so she sits in like 385 feet of water.
Okay. Okay, so it took about just under an hour to sink. And like, what was the sort of public reaction when it happened?
Well, it was obviously shock. I mean, especially since they had said like, hey, we've reinforced the Britannic, she's more secure than Titanic. We learned our lesson. We've got all these extra safety features. And the fact that it sank in, call it like a fourth or a fifth of the time, was just, people were literally shocked. You could see some headlines in the New York Times there. Now, the interesting thing about this, there was a debate for a very long period of time on how she sank. Right. And there was two theories. Again, there was a big explosion.
On the outside.
On the outside. So they knew it was something on the outside of the ship. It wasn't, and it was in the bow area, and there's really not anything that's going to explode in the bow of a ship generally, at least not this type of ship. Sure. Submarines and things are different. But anyway, the first theory was that it was sunk by torpedoes. Shot by German subs. Now, there was some reason for that. Apparently, some people that were on the Britannic reported seeing trails in the water, like whitewash and trails that they said were torpedo-like. And, it very well could have happened. It was during a war. It would have been a very big act of war if Germany had shot a clearly marked hospital ship.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very clearly marked, as you could see in those drawings, and it had no guns on it, it was not a threat whatsoever. So that would have been a very serious, it was act of war, obviously. But so that was the first theory, was it was a torpedo. The second theory was that it hit an underwater mine. Okay. So over the years, people have done a lot of research into this to try to solve that mystery. I know some of the guys that did some of it, and they worked out it was an underwater mine. A week prior, there's another ship very close to the Britannic called the Bertigala, which was another luxury liner that hit a mine, underwater mine for sure. I've dove that one as well. And it was likely planted by the same German submarine, the U-73, and they have tracks of where the U-73 from archives where it laid its mines, and one is obviously right where the Britannic was. Okay. But the most, I'll call it damning evidence, was that they actually found a mine casing, and they found basically what they would do is they would plant these mines on the bottom of the ocean and float them up. Right. Into where the ships would be, right?
The chains.
So they found the base of a mine, basically right where the Britannic had been. So it's, at this point, it's pretty much a well-accepted, there's still some conspiracy theories that it was a torpedo, but if you talk to most people, they'll agree that it was sank by an underwater mine planted by a German submarine.
Okay, very interesting. So there it sat, in 1916 it was sunk. When was the first expedition to dive on it?
So the first person to dive this was actually Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, okay, nice.
Which is fascinating, right?
I love him.
So, Jacques Cousteau was actually hired to go look for the lost city of Atlantis. So he's in the Aegean looking for the lost city of Atlantis. Mm-hmm. And the Titanic Society said to him, hey, you're kind of in the neighborhood of the Britannic. Would you consider, while you're there, going to look for the Britannic? And they gave him what they thought was the approximate correct location. So he said, yeah, that sounds like a good adventure. I'll go do that as well. So they started using, for the first time I know of actually, some underwater technology which is used today very prolifically, basically side scan sonar. So it was the first time I know of that it was really used to find a shipwreck, and they ended up identifying where it was, and it was pretty far away from where the Titanic Society had thought the Britannic was.
I would just figure that since this was relatively recent, it was probably within living memory of some of the crew, the coordinates would be better. So what happened?
Yeah, you would think. I mean, there was a lot of chaos going on. I mean, it's not like it was in a different ocean, right? I mean, it was still in the same general area.
Yeah.
It was still off the coast of Kea, but they thought it was further away. And yeah, there were eyewitnesses, and there was all kinds of accounts and stuff, but they had the wrong location for sure.
Sure. And real quick, how many people died all told?
I think it was like 40-ish.
Oh, okay.
2 lifeboats worth, so 20
Sure.
to 25 people, maybe 30 people in a lifeboat.
Okay.
So, I mean, given the amount of people that were on the boat in total, it was a relatively small number. And like I said, tragically, if they had, followed the captain's orders,
Right.
there would have been probably, 0 deaths. So Cousteau found it in 1975. And the first time they found it, believe it or not, they dove it on air, which if you're a diver, you'll understand the insanity of doing that. Whoever did it probably felt like they had been at the bar for 3 days drinking.
For the folks on YouTube, there was a collective gasp from the audience when he said that. All the divers are
I know there's quite a few divers in the audience. So yeah, the first time they dove it was actually on air, and that was just to identify it. I mean, literally, I'm assuming somebody went down. Just to give you an idea, like I said, the wreck is in 380 feet of water. The width on that wreck is actually close to 100 feet. So the top rail sits about 280 feet, which is still extremely deep for diving on air. Anyway, they dove it on air. They identified it, said, yes, it's the Britannic. And then they went back a few months later with, I'll call it a real expedition, and dove it. It was actually one of the first times they had used what we call trimix. Trimix is when you mix in that helium. So it's a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen, trimix. It was actually the first time they had dove with trimix. Or pretty much the first time. It was still, like voodoo gas, as they say, pretty much untested. And so they dove in these really cool 3-cylinder things. They would take about 6 minutes to get down to the bottom. They would usually have 9 minutes on the wreck. And then they would decompress. Now, they were diving in wetsuits because dry suits weren't invented. The water's pretty cold in Kia. And but they had a diving bell. So they would basically do the dive.
Okay.
They would come up into the diving bell, take all their gear off. They would flush the water out of the diving bell, and then they would take that diving bell, put it on the deck of the Calypso, and then decompress them in the diving bell while they were dry.
Oh.
So they didn't have to do all their decompression in the water.
Right. Sure.
Cousteau was, I think, 67 years old when he did those dives. Phenomenal, right?
67, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, give it to that guy.
Constitution.
Yeah. So he was the first person to find it, and they did quite a number of dives on it and a bunch of research. Cousteau actually did think, by the way, that it was torpedoed. That was his theory.
Why did he think that? Why was that another theory?
He basically looked at the explosion hole and some of the evidence and thought it was more likely it was a torpedo.
Okay.
So that was, I don't know if he was alive when they positively identified it as a landmine or underwater mine or not, but his theory was torpedo.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what are some of the other, are there any other expeditions to dive down?
Yeah, there's a few, and part of this is, I mean, obviously this is the Adventurers Club, so it's quite an adventure to dive the Britannic. I'll talk about historically what it was like, and we'll get into why I call this diving without a golden ticket. But historically, if you wanted to dive the Britannic, you really needed 2 permits. One was from the Greek government, and you probably realize that the Greek government doesn't work, I'll call it, efficiently. So getting a permit was quite challenging. People waited years to get permits, and then sometimes didn't even get those permits. And then there's actually an individual, Simon Mills, who owns the Britannic. He bought it from the British government. Yeah.
How does that work?
He basically said, hey, I want to buy that thing. And the British government's probably thought, well, we're not going to do anything with it. It's sitting in 400 feet of water. Go ahead, here, pay us some money. And so he paid him 15,000 pounds and bought it. And he literally owns it. I mean, I don't know how it works with the Greek government and him, but he theoretically owns, well, not theoretically, according to the British government, he owns the Britannic.
We could have owned the Britannic, people in this room. We could have passed a hat around and got $15,000. Dang it, huge missed opportunity. Okay.
So you needed a permit from the Greek government, and then you needed a permit from Simon to dive the wreck. The first real big expedition on the next slide is by a very famous guy. His name is Jablonski, Jared Jablonski. And he did this expedition in 1999, and you can see some quotes in there about what they did. But essentially, the permits were the first big thing you had to conquer. You had to be able to get the Greek government to agree to let you to dive it, and Simon. Once you did that, then you had this problem of equipment.
Right.
I mean, Kia is not a hot spot for diving. And so, in this type of technical diving, you need helium, lots of it. You need, if you're going to use a rebreather, you need something called a booster to boost your gases to get them into the tanks at high pressure. You need pure oxygen for your rebreather. Even if you're not doing a rebreather, you still need oxygen to decompress more quickly. So there's all this equipment logistics that you need to figure out, regardless of the permit, right?
Sure.
So Jared and his team went down there in 1999 on this big expedition, spent whatever it was, a month. They literally shipped thousands and thousands of pounds of equipment to go dive this. I mean, this is not like a small, hey, let's go dive the Britannic type thing, right? It's a full-on expedition when you go dive the Britannic. So Jared was kind of like one of the first people to put together, I'll call it a non-commercial kind of private expedition to go dive the Britannic, and there was probably, I don't know, I would guess 12 to 15 guys on that trip.
And then real quick, where can you orient us roughly as to where Kia is? I know we keep talking about it, but just it's in Greece, near Greece, roughly kind of where is it? Orient us to that.
Yeah, I have a slide that shows my path to get there. So how about if we defer the question for a few slides?
Sounds good. Read my mind again.
So there's been other expeditions. There was a Nat Geo expedition in 2009. Richie Kohler, famous diver, if you've ever read Shadow Divers by Richie, and well, he didn't write it, but Richie and Chatterton, I know both those guys were the subject of that book, Shadow Divers. Anyway, Richie was on this expedition, and you can get an idea of, when I say expedition, you can see the ship they were on, right? I mean, I think it was, just from memory, I can't read the slides from here, 60 meters long, a couple hundred feet. They've got all their equipment. Basically what they did is they said, okay, we know we can't rely on equipment and gases and all this other stuff from Greece. So what we're going to do is we're going to pile all the stuff into this literally expedition vessel and take it with us from, I think they went from England. So they put all their rebreathers in there. They were just starting to use rebreathers on this dive. They put all the rebreathers in there, all their gases, all their absorbent for the rebreathers, every bit of equipment they need, they pile into this boat and they sail it. And Richie, there's a really great book that he wrote about this whole expedition. I've of course read it and talked to him about the expedition, but that's Richie on the bottom photo. I mean, they could literally, you could see they had a lift. They had a diver lift that they would lift divers out of the water once they were done with the wreck. And, he basically said there's a lot of things that you're going to count on, and one is the permits are going to be hard, the logistics are going to be impossible, you will run into problems, it's guaranteed. I can't tell you what it is, but it could be anything from missed gases to problems to death. And it's an expedition, right? It's no small undertaking. And that was in 2009. In 2019, there was another expedition. Now, 2019 wasn't that long ago, right? So you would think okay, well now, people have been going, there's probably some things that are on Kia to make this easier. Well, it's not. Rick Ayrton, who's an amazing photographer, wrote another great book that I've read a few times, went, and they literally waited 2 years for permits. This is pre-COVID. They waited 2 years for permits. Didn't even know if they were going to get them. They decided to not rely on shipping equipment because they didn't know if it would get there, if it would get there in time, or get there, not broken. So they literally got vans and drove their equipment. I think he said 55 tanks worth of gas. Drove all their equipment to Greece.
From where?
From the UK.
Okay.
They drove it, yeah.
Okay.
Again, the picture I'm trying to paint here is going and diving the Britannic isn't a simple matter of, hey, I want to learn to dive deep and I'm going to go dive the Britannic, right? There's a massive amount of infrastructure you need to bring and permits you need to get, and it's not just about the diving. It's a true expedition/adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And has infrastructure improved any more since 2019?
Yeah, for sure. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the real question is how did three guys go do this, right? I mean, you've got the challenges of permits. You've got the challenges of infrastructure. We're going to talk about the weather in just a minute. There could be massive currents. I'm going to talk about that and show you an example. It's obviously deep.
Sure.
So the real question is okay, how do these three guys who are just, good divers, but they're not associated with Hollywood, they're not associated with Nat Geo, they're just three guys who want to go dive it. And that's the key question is like, okay, like how did we go do this? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit.
Real quick, what is a golden ticket? Is it
Yeah, we're
one
going
of
to
the
talk about
permits,
that.
or is it all of those things put together?
So if you could go, whoops, our slides went out.
Give it a second. Give it a second. All right, our slides just came off, but
Okay, so I'll describe what the golden ticket is. This is my buddy Justin. He was one of the divers, and that is him in front of the bridge on the Britannic. So there's a famous movie. It was actually based on a book called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
I do love
And I don't know if people in the audience have seen it, but it's kind of a weird movie. Gene Wilder was in it.
too.
I think they're making a remake, or they did a remake.
Johnny Depp. Mhm.
Oh, okay. I don't watch many current
Johnny Depp
movies.
fans?
Anyway, so in Willy Wonka, the kind of the basis of the story is this guy, Willy Wonka, who has a chocolate factory and candy factory. He's going to invite, and it's very mysterious, this factory, he's going to invite people to come to the factory, but you have to get a golden ticket.
Right.
And there's only 5 golden tickets in the world, and they're buried in chocolate bars.
Yeah.
So, kids would buy chocolate bars hoping to get a golden ticket, and once you got a golden ticket, you were in.
It's like winning the lottery.
It's literally like winning the lottery. So the question is, like, how did we get to dive the Britannic without winning the lottery? That's the big thing. And so without slides, we can talk about it for sure. So what happened is there's a guy who runs a dive shop in Kia. His name is Yanni, and he runs Kia Divers. And he had been lobbying the Greek government, again, that moves very fast, for a long time to allow people to dive the Britannic. And he eventually broke through, and he got to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and they realized, like, hey, we can generate some tourism and some more dollars and help bolster the phenomenal Greek economy.
There we go.
So
Finally.
so they actually, and they created this thing called the Kia. That's where we'll talk about where Kia is specifically in a minute, but they created the Kia Underwater Historic Park. And in that park are 3 wrecks right now. They're trying to add more. There's the
nice.
Patrice, which is a paddle wheel steamer, which is a phenomenal dive. If people go there, by the way, it's within recreational diving limits, so you don't have to be a technical diver to dive the Patrice. That's a picture of it right there. It's a beautiful paddle wheel steamer. There's the Bertigala that I talked about, which is another ocean liner that sank by an underwater mine, and then there's, of course, the Britannic. So when this happened, when they created this park, they basically said people who are authorized to take divers hold I'll call it a master permit. So now the permit process gets vastly easier.
Sure. Okay.
So this happened in like 2022, and when it happened, I literally, the day I heard about it, I emailed my friend Ben, who was one of the guys on the 3 of us that went, and I said, hey, like, let's go do it. I had been wanting to dive the Britannic for half a decade and have looked into it quite extensively and realized like the cost, the permit problem, the logistics, the expense, and everything else, and said like, okay, well, this probably won't happen. So when I found out about the Underwater Historic Park, I started looking into it with Ben. And what also happened when Yanni realized this was going to happen is he started building infrastructure in his dive shop for technical diving. So he has a compressor and he has a booster, and they bought a bunch of helium and oxygen and rebreather supplies. And so they essentially created infrastructure so that I didn't need to bring tanks. I didn't need to bring gases. I didn't need to bring absorbent for my rebreather, all that stuff. So permits and I'll call it gear logistics got greatly simplified when that happened.
Right. Now you don't need a giant ship.
I don't need a 200-foot. I'll show you what we dove in, and it will shock you, probably. So what did I bring? I brought about 200 pounds of gear.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's an easy trip or it's light, but I brought about 200 pounds of stuff in like 4 or 5 different suitcases. And, the thing to keep in mind on an adventure or an expedition like this is just because they have some logistics and gas filling and things like that at the Kia Divers, you're still very remote. I mean, it's not like you're going to Los Angeles to go diving or New York or, any place like that. So I had to bring spares for everything. I mean, literally everything. because if something happens, your trip is done. And the other thing is you don't want your equipment to fail on a dive like the Britannic. Right. I mean, stuff happens, and you don't have complete control over it. But if you're, that's not the dive you want stuff to go bad on. Like I did, you can maybe see it in the picture. I don't know if you can see it. I had tiny little pinhole in one of my dry gloves. I dive with dry gloves. And water got in, not a lot of water, but luckily, I had extra gloves, I had extra seals, I had extra everything. You can see I had like literally 3 pages of things that I needed to make sure I brought to this expedition. Because again, if you forget something, it's not like you can go to the corner 7-Eleven or corner dive store and pick it up. It doesn't exist.
What does it mean if a little bit of water gets in your dry glove?
You get cold.
All right.
And we'll talk about how long the dives are, but it's not pleasant, for sure. So you get basically ocean water going into your dry glove and getting inside your dry suit, and your dry suit is no longer a dry suit. It's now a wetsuit.
And a cold suit.
Yes, and cold.
Usually it defeats the purpose. Okay, so getting to Kia. Deferred that question. What's it like now?
Yeah, so getting to Kia is actually, I'll call it relatively easy. I mean, everything is relative. I've gone to Bikini Atoll where getting there takes 2 or 3 days. Yeah. So getting to Kia, I personally flew LAX to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Athens. So, LAX to Frankfurt is, 11, 12 hours, whatever it is. Frankfurt to Athens is 2-3 hours, whatever that is. Once you get to Athens, you take call it 45-minute taxi ride south of the airport to the port of Lavrio, and there's ferries in Lavrio, and you take call it hour-long ferry from Lavrio to Kia.
Okay.
Now,
that's pretty easy.
Yeah, so like I said, it's all relative, but for me, that's an easy trip. I mean, that's like, it takes a day, basically. And the key is if you don't get to Lavrio in time for the last ferry, then you're stuck in Lavrio for the night, unless the guy who owns the dive shop, Yanni, is feeling sorry for you and is in a good mood, which he always is, actually. And he comes in his own personal boat and picks you up. That lower picture on the right is his boat. And I literally thought I was going to start my dive on the trip from Lavrio to Kia. The ocean was extremely rough. I've been in very rough waters. I mean, I've gone to Antarctica. And the water was pretty darn rough, and his boat isn't that big. And Ben and I, the guy I was with, looked at each other, and we thought, oh, man, we're going in the drink. But Yanni got us across the channel, and we got to Kia. So Kia is call it 20 miles off the coast of Greece, just south of Athens.
Gotcha. Okay, with you. And how big is the island roughly?
It's not that big. I'd say it's probably maybe 20 miles across, and maybe in one direction, maybe 15 miles across in the other. So it's a pretty small island. It's mainly like a kind of summer vacation island. We got there in October, and it was the end of the season. I mean, half the hotels were closed. Well, there's not a lot of hotels, but the hotels were closed. Half the restaurants were closed.
You had the place to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty. Actually, I enjoyed it quite immensely. We stayed. You can see in the upper. Let's see, for the audience, it would be your upper left picture. I guess same for me. Which is we just rented an apartment from this lady that the dive shop owner introduced me to. The funny thing is, I said to her name is Maria. I said before we got there, I said, Maria, can you tell me the street and the number of the apartment in case we need to take a taxi and tell them where it is? And she wrote back and she said, ha ha ha, there are no street names and numbers in Kia. She said, if I'll be there to pick you up, but if I'm not there, then when you get a taxi, just tell them you're in the house above the Three Sisters restaurant. Okay. And I'm like, okay.
Sounds good.
So anyway, so it's a very quiet island. It's known for yachts and things like that, but it's a quiet island. The food there is Mediterranean. It's fantastic, a lot of seafood, and I definitely enjoyed my time there.
And what are conditions like on the ocean?
Oh man, this is
get out there.
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges. Not only do you have to get past the permit problem, and you have to get past all the logistics problem and get all your gear there and get that all sorted out, but Kia is basically there's kind of mountainous parts of Kia and mountainous parts of Athens and Greece, and there's this big funnel in between them, and the winds can get whipping fast going through that channel. And so when you go dive Kia, a good estimate is you're going to dive half the days.
Okay.
Because the wind literally from one day can go from like 2 knots to like 30 knot gale force winds
Whoa.
in a day.
Yeah.
So I have a video. Now this is the ferry that's coming into the port of Kia. The port of Kia, by the way, I'm out hiking that day because we couldn't dive. The port of Kia is like literally 100 yards away to my left in that picture, and you
Okay.
could see how far out the boat is going.
Right. And it's just going to drift all
Because it's going to
the
get
way over.
pushed by wind all the way into the harbor. I mean, you could see the white caps, and you could see that thing is a massive ferry. I mean, that thing takes like 40 or 50 cars in it across the channel. So
Yeah.
it can get really serious.
Yeah.
And so you just have to plan like. I might get diving, I might not. I know a guy who went there, a very famous diver, who went there for like 3 or 4 weeks and got 1 dive day.
3 or 4 weeks?
Yes, and got 1 dive day.
One day.
We went there, we had 9 days planned for diving, and we got 6 days of diving, and I was extremely happy with that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So that gives you an idea of the other kind of challenge to doing the dive is you have to get a weather window.
Sure. All right. So like you brought your 200 pounds of gear, but what do you take with you? What's like your actual loadout? When you
Yeah,
go
my
diving?
loadout. So I took my rebreather. That's that big yellow thing in the upper left corner. So I took my rebreather on every dive. We took a bunch of bailout cylinders. When you dive a rebreather, you have to plan for the rebreather failing. I mean, hopefully it doesn't do that. But if it does, you have to have enough regular scuba tanks and regular gas with you to do your full decompression obligation without your rebreather.
Okay.
So when you go do these dives, I had my rebreather on me, and I had 3 tanks. Some people took 4, I took 3. And I had my camera, and you have a scooter. A scooter is an underwater thing that can propel you through the water.
I see.
Because there are massive, or can be massive currents on the Britannic. So you've got all this gear that you basically have to prep and get ready and make sure every bit of it is working before you even go out to dive.
Okay. So what was like the most, I mean, obviously like the rebreather is most important, but what was the other thing was there anything else that you had to make sure was like absolutely functional?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a lot of things you can fix underwater.
Okay.
Even if your rebreather fails, depending upon the way it fails, you can even survive that.
Okay.
The thing that is probably one of the worst failures you can have underwater is either your scooter dies when there's current, and you can't get back to the wreck, or you have a problem. We'll talk about why that's a big problem in a minute.
Yeah.
Or your dry suit floods.
Okay.
Because you can't recover from a dry suit flood.
Sure.
I mean, if it floods at the beginning of the dive, you abort the dive.
Right.
But if it happens to flood, let's say when you're just leaving the Britannic and you've got 3.5 hours of decompression obligation, you do not have a choice, really. So for me, quite honestly, my dry suit was extremely important. So you inspect it before the dives, you make sure it's not leaking. As I said, I had a couple small problems on mine, but I was able to fix them. I had spares and things. It wasn't anything big, but I was always thinking in the back of my mind, like, okay, and I have a heated vest inside my dry suit as well.
Nice.
So that if it does flood, I can at least try to generate some heat, but it's pretty ugly if your dry suit floods.
What are temperatures down there?
I think I have a slide on it, but I think it's about 60 Fahrenheit at the bottom and 70 Fahrenheit on deco. So again, temperature's all relative. It's not a really cold dive, but when you're in the water for that long, it is. So.
Right. So is this your boat?
Yeah, that's the boat. That is what's called a rib, a rigid inflatable boat. And you can get an idea of the difference between the boat we dove in and the boat that Richie dove in. Again, we're not a Net Geo funded expedition. We dove in ribs, believe it or not. Most people would think it's absurd to do a 400-foot dive in a rib, but that's what we did.
Hot take? I feel like that's more adventurous. I'm just saying.
Definitely,
I'm just saying.
definitely more adventurous, for sure. So yes, we dove in ribs.
All right. So let's talk through each one of your dive days. You had 6 of them.
So so typical dive day, obviously we'd inspect all our tanks, make sure they were still filled. You make sure they're all off at the end of the day, but double check before you do your dive. Are all the tanks pressurized? Double check that they have all the right tanks to put on the boat. Build your, what we call build your rebreather. So make sure you build it correctly. I've got a checklist. Every time I've done, I don't know how many dives on my rebreather, probably about 800 hours worth of diving. But I go through a checklist every time. So you build your rebreather, and then what you do is you take all that stuff and you put it in the back of a van. This is a picture of the van on the left. The middle picture is all the safety tanks. They would put safety tanks in the water for us. I'll show you what that means in just a minute. The far right picture is just another view of the van. But you basically take all your equipment. That's 4 divers worth of equipment, by the way.
Oh, wow.
In that van on the left. And then you put it into the rib. So you can see on the left picture there that the rib is full of all of our equipment. All the divers go in one rib with all their equipment, bailout tanks, scooter, camera, and everything else. Safety divers, safety equipment, the decompression station, I'll tell you about in a minute, that goes in the other boat. So they basically take, for 3 divers, there's 3 divers and a guide. You have to have a guide. That's part of the Underwater Historic Park guidelines.
Sure.
So we had a guide, his name is George. The 4 of us would get in one boat, and then there'd be about 3 or 4 other people in the other boat. And both boats would go out to the dive site. So I have a kind of a quick video of what it's like getting out to the dive site. That's my friend Ben. That is George. So it's, I mean, you know, some days you have like not a lot of waves, other days you have big waves. But basically, yeah, you put all your stuff in a rib and you go out to the dive site. So when you get to the dive site, they basically set up a decompression station. Like I said, we'll talk about the length of the decompression in a minute, but you have very long decompression times. And so what they do is they essentially put a line down to the wreck. So they go over it with like sonar and they know where the wreck is, and they're good enough to know like, okay, when you do your dive planning, you say like, I want to go to the bow, or I want to go to the stern, or I want to go to the bridge.
Oh,
and
interesting. Okay.
they put the down line down. I mean, it's 900 feet long, right?
Sure.
So you don't want to spend your dive going the length of the wreck if you want to go see a specific thing. So they put the down line down. They tie up that decompression station. You'll see a photo of that in a minute, to that down line, and then you start your dive.
Okay.
Now, because you're in a rib, and because there can be current, you literally have to put everything on in the rib. Like your rebreather.
Sure.
3 or 4 tanks of scuba gas.
Yeah.
Your scooter.
Okay.
And I had a camera. So I literally had a camera, a scooter, 3 tanks, and my rebreather. And you're sitting on the edge of the rib doing this.
Right.
Luckily, there's guys there to help you. You can't do all this yourself. You just can't, right? So they help you get all your tanks on, but you're literally sitting there rocking in this rib, waiting for them to say, okay. And then you splash, and that's my friend Justin. So he took some GoPro video, so this will give you an idea of kind of what it's like to get down to the Britannic.
Yeah, please.
So you can see him kind of looking around. What he's doing basically is spotting where the downline is, because once you hit the water, if there's current, you can't screw around, right? You got to know exactly where that downline is, and trust me, when you hit the water, you can see it's very disorienting. You're like, okay, which way is up? I got all these tanks, I got a scooter, I got to make sure I got that going. And you have to immediately get on the scooter, and you have to head towards the downline. If you don't make it to the downline, which George and I didn't one dive, you basically have to take everything off, get back in the boat, and do it again.
Okay. So you can't find it. You just have to get out, try again.
Well, you can find it, but the problem is if there's current, you can't get to it.
Right.
The current can be stronger than the scooter.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes.
All right, that's pretty gnarly.
Yeah, it could be very gnarly. So now you can see he double clicks to go maximum speed. I've sped this up so that you don't have to live through 5 minutes of nothing, but you can see the line. It's that white kind of slanting thing off to the left diagonal. So he's going down the line. You follow the line. That's Ben. Again, you can tell the video's sped up, but that's Ben in front of him. And you'll see the Britannic come into view in just a second.
So cool. I love
It
that.
literally takes 5 to 6 minutes on full throttle on a scooter to get down to that wreck.
But I bet when you see it kind of like emerge.
There it
out of
is.
Yep. It's the coolest thing. That's the coolest. So where is this dive?
So that was tied in right near the davits.
Gotcha. So
near the
by
stern.
the back.
Yeah, by the back. This is another video that my friend Ben made. I'm a stills photographer. He's a video photographer, but this will give you an idea of kind of what it's like to dive the Britannic.
You really get a sense that it's like almost therapeutic to be down there. You know?
Yeah, it's peaceful for sure. I mean, there can be current, but it's, obviously there's not a lot of people down there.
No?
It's generally quiet. You can hear your scooter, but because we're on rebreathers, there's not a lot of gas. That's George, our guide. Phenomenal diver. That guy he's amazing. think I'm in the background on one of these videos taking photos somewhere, but that's the bathtub in the basically captain's quarters. It's on, again, it's on its side, so you can see the bathtub is on its side, right? This is going along the top of the promenade deck. I have a video inside the promenade deck in a little bit. You know, one thing to keep in mind is obviously, you know, like on a dive like this, you have to be, I'll call it controlled. You can't be panicking. You can't be kicking around. It's, especially this deep on a rebreather, you have to be really careful about how you exert yourself so that you don't what they call overbreathe your rebreather. So it's you really have to be comfortable in this environment to go do this dive.
Yeah.
It should definitely not be your first dive to this depth.
Yeah.
There I am off to the left. That's me with that yellow Revo kicking a little bit, finning.
I just feel like it's just so important to be prepared too, because like you said, you can't panic.
No,
so
it's mental preparation is a big thing. We basically do kind of failure planning. We say like, okay, if this goes wrong, what are we going to do? Like, as part of our dive plan, we're like, okay, we're going to go to the props. I'm going to take pictures of this. You're going to take pictures of that. You're going to go here. You're going to go there. Okay, if we get separated, here's what we're going to do. If somebody comes off the wreck, here's what we're going to do. If two people come off the wreck, here's what we're going to do. And you know, it's like, okay, we're going to spend 25 to 27 minutes on the wreck. We're going to go back to the downline. So you do all this basically contingency planning as part of your dive plan. It's absolutely critical, and you have to kind of mentally prepare. I spend quite a bit of time before a dive like that, just like visualizing what the dive's going to be like, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to take photos of, because you don't have time when you're down there to fix things or screw around with things. And so, yeah, time is against you for sure.
Sure. Now, what is this chart here?
Most divers might recognize this, but basically this is my dive profile for a single dive. Okay. And that white line is my depth. So you can see it goes down pretty darn fast. We're going at, call it 60 to 70 feet per minute to get down. And then I'm kind of going up and down, exploring different parts of the wreck, and then you can see the white line start to go up. Right. The red portion in the middle is basically my decompression obligation. So it tells me where I have to stop and for how long. And you can tell it's obviously an exponential curve. So your decompression stops might be, your first one might be 180 feet for a minute. And then they usually go in 10-foot increments, 170 feet for 2 minutes, 160 feet for 4 minutes, 150 feet, et cetera. Your last stop is somewhere between usually 20 and 10 feet, and it's the longest one. Just a couple things about this. So this dive, I think, was 4 hours or so. So basically 5 or 6 minutes down to the wreck, 25 to 30 minutes on the wreck, and then call it 3 to 3.5 hours of decompression.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy.
A short amount of time.
Can you go back to it for just a sec? There's one thing to keep in mind, and this comes back a little bit to planning. The way these kind of like models for decompression work is it's exponential. So there's something on a computer called delta plus 5. If I spend 5 more minutes, how much more time in decompression am I going to have to spend?
Okay, I see.
So that gives you an ability to basically plan. So if something goes wrong, like if I get caught on some monofilament or something, like, or I'm just having a great dive and I want to spend another 5 minutes taking photos, what will that cost me?
Right.
On a dive like this, your delta plus 5 is usually about 30 minutes.
Right. So
you spend 5 on the rack, you're going to do another 30 minutes of decompression.
Okay.
And it does not go up linearly.
Right.
Like if I spend another 5 minutes, the delta plus 5 might be like 40 minutes. So it's extremely important that you, as they say in the dive world, like plan your dive and dive your plan. Like there's really no altering that.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's an emergency, you have to alter it, but that's pretty much the rule.
Right.
You don't mess around. And yeah, so it's 3.5 hours. I have some pictures of me on decompression. I call it doing time or doing deco time. Right. We actually took down, on most of our dives, one, there was too much current, so they didn't let us use it. But I had a little iPhone in a waterproof housing, and they would stash it for us at 70 feet deep. And so I would come up and get my iPhone. And I personally, I like music, so I would listen to music on Deco for most of it. Ben and Justin would watch movies. This is me on Deco.
Watch movies.
You can get an idea of current. You could see I'm holding onto a John line right there, and I was actually having some buoyancy issues, and so I'm actually off gas. I'm trying to get rid of some gas to go back down, and you could see a safety diver come up to me swimming. You could see he's kicking as fast as he can, and you could see how fast the bubbles are going back.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm basically holding on for dear life to that John line. We'll talk about why it's so important in just a second, but. So I would listen to music, and Justin actually Ben would watch movies or TV or whatever he watched. Justin had this funny thing. He's a pretty serious diver, and he does a bunch of really long cave dives. And he had this thing about watching the entire Breaking Bad series while on Deco. The entire thing, and I think he's probably done it. I mean, he does like 12-hour cave dives where they go into what's called a habitat and spend like 8 hours of decompression.
I see.
Yeah, so anyway,
the entire Breaking Bad series.
Yeah, the entire Breaking Bad series. So anyway, one of my main missions there, oh, and just really quick, one other quick thing, I've mentioned this before, and I mentioned the current. The reason this is so important is, I don't know if people saw it, you probably didn't, but on one of those pictures, there's like a massive shipping channel in between Kia and Athens. I mean, that's where the Britannic was, right? That's a major shipping lane.
Sure.
Yeah,
okay.
you can see it with the red arrow, right? I mean, that's a tanker. And we're pretty small compared to tankers.
Yeah.
And I think Richie in one of his comments mentioned this, and it's a pretty well-known thing. What they do when you dive the Britannic is they alert the maritime authorities that there's going to be divers on the Britannic. Mm-hmm. Now, that channel isn't that wide, so they try to skirt you and go around you, obviously. But if you lose the deco station, or you come off the wreck and there's deco deep, and you don't make it back to that line that goes up to the deco station, you're basically drifting.
Right, and so you can drift.
For 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
In a shipping channel. And divers carry what's called a surface marker buoy, which is called a 6-foot tall tube that's painted orange. Or is orange colored, but at the end of the day, like that's a small ship is not going to see that. So the reason they have 2 ribs there, one with the divers and one with the safety equipment, is if somebody does get blown off the wreck and they see an SMB, surface marker buoy, they will follow that diver.
Okay.
But it's still a rib and a 6-foot tall marker compared to like a tanker.
A giant tanker, yeah.
So again, one of the risks of diving the Britannic is the current and just the conditions. You really have to make sure you're going to get back to that downline. And once you're on the downline, you do not want to let go of it in current. Mm-hmm. And so it's like paramount that you do not want to do drift deco. I mean, if you have to do it, you have to do it. But, it's definitely not a good idea.
Okay.
So my main goal, or not main goal, my main goal is to dive the Britannic, but I'm an underwater photographer as well. So I took my camera with me and took some photos. It's obviously, pretty challenging to take photos 400 feet deep. There's, multiple challenges. One is the lack of light. I mean, you'll see there's pretty good light in most of my photos, but there's definitely a lack of light, lack of color that deep. Everything is pretty much blue. Mm-hmm. And, you're deep, so you don't have a lot of time to compose photos. It's not like I could sit there for 10 minutes and focus and do stuff.
Right, that's like your whole time.
Yeah, you have to have a plan. You have to know what you want to photograph. I spent a lot of time studying the wreck, studying other people's photographs to figure out what I wanted to do and when.
So interesting.
But for people in the audience who are camera people, I was, you'll see some of these photos. I took a lot of what's called natural light photos, so I had other people with light, and I would just shoot with no light. Sometimes I would shoot with flashes and other stuff, but a lot of times it was just natural light. So I would boost my what's called ISO, or sensitivity, of the digital camera to like 10,000, which is unheard of in
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's massive, but you really don't have a choice because, you can't open up the aperture more than X, and, I would shoot at like a 30th of a second. You're underwater, so things move slower, so I can shoot pretty slow, but still, you really have to boost your ISO if you're going to take natural light photos on something like the Britannic.
Is there any accounting for the water pressure that low? Like, does it affect the camera in any way?
Yeah, I mean, you have to put your camera in a special housing. I have a housing, and in fact, I had to send my housing to the manufacturer before this dive to get special springs put in it, because you can access most controls, but those springs are kind of, I'll call it, calibrated for no more than 300 feet of water, basically. So if you're going to go to 380 feet of water, you need special springs in your camera housing so that things still work underwater.
Okay.
So yeah, you need a very special housing and a bunch of other kind of underwater specific stuff to take pictures.
All right. Now these photos, you know, are of orient. So like, what are we looking at with these?
Yeah. So I'm going to show you a bunch of photos. A bunch of them are going to be up near the front. These are just different diagrams and things that people have built. You'll see in the front of this the big crack in the bow. So I'm going to show some photos of that crack.
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
And the bow itself. And then I'll also show some pictures of the props in the stern. But just to give you an orientation, that's
Gotcha.
kind of that big crack in the front. That's where
Gotcha.
that underwater mine hit. And that's where the Britannic went down. When it hit the sand, it kind of collapsed that part of the
And
bow.
that's on the left side of the picture.
Yeah, but my photos, you won't be able to tell what's left and, well, you kind of can. But
Sure.
so the first one is the actual explosion area. Can you
Next
go
slide, Phoebe.
forward, Phoebe? There we go. So that's the explosion area. What you're looking at is kind of three divers. There's one in the top, that's George, and then Ben and Justin down below. And again, that's kind of looking from the deck. So again, it sits on its starboard side. So I'm kind of like on the other side of the deck, shooting back towards the wreck of that big, huge collapse where the landmine was. And you can kind of start to get a sense of scale with that, the three divers in it. I mean, it's just absolutely massive. And then the next one, this is that same area. Now, the bridge is just off to the left of this. You'll see a picture of the bridge in a little bit. That's one diver, that's George. He's letting up an area. I believe that's basically where the fireman's tunnel is, which is where you can go inside the wreck. Now, you need an extra special permit to go inside the wreck. We couldn't do any penetration. I know some people who have a permit, so I'm trying to finagle my way into one of their trips. But there is ways to get inside. And like I said, I know a couple guys who have done pretty extensive penetration and research into this wreck. But again, you can get an idea of the size and scope of things with George there.
And we got the bow next, it looks like.
Yeah, so this is the bow, the pointing end of the ship, for those people who don't know bow. And you can see the big stanchions there where they would tie off stuff and anchors and things like that. But those are three guys at the point of the bow. The bow is one of the deeper sections of the wreck. It is like 385-ish feet. So I kind of hung back to get these photos and let those guys with their lights go out to the bow. But it's pretty majestic for sure. And again, you can get an idea of how intact the whole wreck is. This is my friend Justin at the bridge. You can get an idea of the equipment you carry. He's got 2 tanks on his back for his rebreather. He dives a funky rebreather called a Choptima. But he's got 2 tanks on his back, a tank on his left, and he had another tank as well. But that's him at the bridge of the Britannic.
Okay.
But again, it's just a massive amount of equipment.
Yeah. These props are massive.
Yeah, so I've got a black and white photo of what they actually look like. Again, there was 3 props. There was 2 outboard props and 1 in the middle.
Right.
They're like, I don't know, 25, 30 feet across. You can get an idea. Now, the interesting thing, if you look really close at this photo, is you can see all 3 props. It happened a little bit by accident. You can obviously see that the guy illuminating the top prop, that's Ben. The middle prop is kind of where that light goes across the deck. There's that piercing light. That's the middle prop.
Okay.
And then underneath, you can see a kind of an area that's lit up. That's my friend Justin under the wreck lighting up the 3rd prop.
I see. Okay.
Now, to get this shot, you need to be in like a very specific place because most times one of those props is going to be obscured
Right.
by the rudder, by the other prop, by the hull, something. So quite honestly, this happened a little bit by accident. We tried to reproduce it and get a better photo, but I had wanted this photo. There's one guy, that guy Rick Ayrton, who wrote that book. He's got one looking up through where you can see the one on top. Just to give you an idea of scale, you can fit between that middle prop and the rudder. I have a picture of a guy swimming up through that, between the prop and the rudder. Yeah, so it's massive.
It's a big area. Yeah.
It's huge, yeah.
And we can see even more on this next one here.
Yeah, so this is again a shot of Ben. He's shining his lights. Again, these are all natural light. I'm not putting any light from my camera on it, but Ben is shining his lights onto that's the port side or the upper prop. And again, you can just get an idea of the size.
Yeah.
And why you wouldn't want to be in a rowboat going towards that.
What is visibility like just generally, like to the naked eye?
So good question. The visibility is usually, call it like 60 to 80 feet. So there's pretty good visibility.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Down near the bottom of the wreck, on the underneath prop side, you can get some call it 20, 30, 40 feet of visibility down there, just because, like, especially with current, there's like, sand and stuff getting kicked up a little bit. But in general, on top of the wreck, it's really good visibility. Most dives.
Sure, yeah. And what are we looking at here?
So here you can kind of see, I'll have a more detailed picture in a minute, but in the background, you can see those two big crane davits sticking up. They're kind of like in a shadow. But this is kind of like from the stern looking towards the bow, and those are the two big crane davits. And then on the next slide, I have a closer picture. All that stuff on the top is not backscattered. Don't worry, those are actually little fish. But you can get a sense. I mean, I didn't have a diver on it, but those davits are probably 20 feet long. I mean, they're absolutely massive.
Okay.
Then the next slide is like I said, we were allowed to go through the promenade deck because it's pretty much open. It's not what I would call a real penetration, but this is actually one of my favorite photos. So George is off to the left. That's our guide. And he's illuminating the top of the promenade deck. I swam along the top, and then Ben and Justin went inside the promenade deck and swam through it. I have a video of them going through it in just a minute, but you can see all the fish, and it's beautiful. I've seen this in other places in that area of the world, like in Malta and Croatia, where you get these yellow sponges that are all over the wreck that are just, when you illuminate them, they're beautiful.
Is there a lot of reclamation going on down there? Is there a lot of sea life on the wreck?
There's a lot of smaller fish. Sometimes you see a bigger fish in the distance, but there's a lot of these small fish, but nothing like major, no.
Okay.
This is Justin coming out of the promenade deck. You can kind of see it in the background where he came out. And so you start this tour kind of back where those davits were, and you go all the way through the entire promenade deck, all the way to the bridge, near the front where that bow collapse is.
Sure. Okay.
So this is Justin coming out again. He's got a scooter with him. I personally would never do this dive without a scooter. I just, with the current and the conditions and the work of effort you have to go through to swim and everything, I would never do it without a scooter. So there Justin is coming out. The next slide, it's a little bit hard to see, so I put the real picture of it, but this is basically the control for where it's up on the bridge, and this is where they controlled, port forward, back, reverse, all that other stuff. So this, you can imagine, this is where the captain was basically giving orders to stop the engines, start the engines, go for shore, all that type of stuff. It's ship terms, it's called a telegraph, because it tells the guys doing the engine work what to do. And then next, this is what it looks like going through the promenade, and I've got a video of it. This video was shot by my friend Ben. It's not mine. That's Justin in front of him. And again, it is peaceful. I mean, it's there's no sound because of scuba, because we're on rebreathers, but it's it's a very unique experience to be on a wreck like this. That's this big. That's this deep. That's kind of this historic.
And no air bubbles either.
No, it's a rebreather.
Out about rebreathers, yeah.
There's a lot of people who dive rebreathers when they go look for fish life. I generally don't do that, but because there's no bubbles and they don't scare fish. I mean, it is true. Like if you're diving on a rebreather, fish come right up to you. They don't care that you're there, as opposed to open circuit scuba.
So for people wanting to recreate this trip of yours, what do you recommend?
So. Just out of curiosity, has anybody in the audience dove the Britannic? I mean, it's not.
Anyone else?
Okay.
No one?
I mean, it's possible for sure.
No one yet. No one yet.
I think, quite honestly, I think there's been way fewer people on the Britannic than Everest. I mean, I think probably by a factor of maybe 3 or 4. There's just not a lot. I think it's becoming more common now because of the permits and the logistics, but obviously the depth is still pretty deep, and it's a very committing dive. But, my recommendation is it's a true expedition, obviously. Take everything you need, spares for everything, plan it like a true expedition. You need a scooter. I talked about that. I would personally never do this dive without a scooter, even if there was no current, because you just never know if current comes up, and it's just getting down 300 feet. If you're swimming it, your work of breathing goes up, and it just increases risk. You obviously need to be comfortable in depths like this. I mean, that goes without saying, especially if you combine in current and just the wow factor of diving the Britannic. There's a lot of teamwork. if you're going to dive a wreck like this, you have to be very comfortable. I mean, it's obvious, but it's worth stating. You have to be very comfortable with the people you're going with.
Right, you gotta
with
have
their
a-
skill set, their ability to help you if you have a problem, your ability to help them when they have a problem. It is very much team diving. I do a lot of, don't tell anybody, solo diving. Obviously not on stuff like this. This is not that. This is very much a team sport.
Okay.
So you need a good team.
And this is not a beginner dive either. Like all of you need to be like on it, about that life.
And you know, I mean, this is, and you know, it's like I said, it's teamwork, but it's more than just the divers in the water, right? There was, you know, I don't know how many people there are in that photo, called 10 people. There was 4 of us diving. There's the captains for each rib. There's 2 or 3 safety divers. There's usually at least one person who's helping you get your gear on, and then the 4 divers. You rely on those other people.
Sure.
Like you rely on the safety divers. They stage extra tanks in case you lose one or you need more gas. If your rebreather fails and you need more gas, they'll bring gas to you. They check on you. When you get to decompression, they take your extra cylinders that you don't need to make your decompression easier. So it's very much like a team sport.
Right. Yeah.
And you have to look at it like that, and you have to work as part of a team. There's no cowboy diving with this, for sure.
So what are your final impressions having done this amazing thing?
Well, again, you know, I really do look at it like getting to dive it without a golden ticket. I thought for a long time, like, there's just no way on earth I'm ever going to get to dive the Britannic. I mean, I don't work at Nat Geo. I don't know Hollywood producers. You know, I'm a fairly good diver and fairly good photographer, but like, you just don't get to go on these trips. And that all did change literally in June of 2022.
Yeah.
I did my trip in October of last year. So it's approachable. I mean, it's not out of, you know, the possibility of diving it if you have the skills and experience, or you willing to take the time to do that. So it's possible. For me, it literally is the pinnacle of wreck diving. I mean, I've been on a lot of wrecks, a lot of famous wrecks. I still have a lot to go, but this for me was the pinnacle. It was, you know, pretty much a lifelong dream to dive it.
Would you recommend it?
Oh, no. Yeah, of course. But again, you know, I do think it's, you know, you really need to be comfortable at those depths, and
Sure.
you need to train and practice. And but yeah, I mean, if you have the skills, I couldn't recommend it more. For me, it's absolutely epic to dive this wreck.
Fantastic. I want to go to the next slide, Phoebe. And before we wrap up, I just want to talk about one of your upcoming projects. You know, stories about misadventures in diving.
This is actually, so I don't know how much time we have. I'll try to go through this a little quickly. This is actually a past project. I was in Palau in August of 2022. And I gave this presentation at California Wreck Divers, and some people requested that I talk about it a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
There was a pretty serious incident I was involved in Palau. Actually, a very serious incident. We were diving on a wreck called the Sata. It's an upside-down Japanese oiler that was sank in World War II. There's a big bomb hole you can kind of see in the front. Again, it's upside down, so the bow is towards the right side of that photo. And
Gotcha. And there's a big
that's
old
the pointy
hole in
end,
there.
and then the stern is on the left. And there's a torpedo hole in the stern. So anyway,
Yeah, for ships.
so there was 8 of us diving. 2 guys went to that torpedo area in the stern where the engine room is. 6 of us went out on the bow, and we were going to take some we did take some pictures looking back at the bow of the ship. And then 2 guys were going to go do something else. 4 of us were going to go do a penetration into the wreck. So you can go to the next one. We'll talk about that clothespin in just a minute, but that's that big bomb hole. So that's where we stage our extra tanks. So 4 of us went inside this wreck. We were led by a local guy, his name is Matt, who had done this dive, call it 25, 30 times. And it was a traverse. So basically you go into one side of the wreck, and you go and you see this thing called the bottle room, and then you go out another side of the wreck.
Gotcha.
So again, this guy Matt had done it 20 or 30 times. So you can go to the next one. So 4 of us went inside this wreck. You can get an idea of kind of what the visibility was going to be like after we went inside this wreck.
It's not good.
No, not good. And because it's upside down and it's in what we call the forecastle, or the front area of the boat, it's all crumpled. There's no straight passageways. It's not like, okay, I'm going down the 3rd deck and I'm going towards the bow, which is north, and I'm at 140 feet, and there's none of that. I mean, it's like literally a funhouse maze as we go through this.
But that sounds fun.
Oh, yeah, it's fun. You can go to the next one. So we got into the wreck, and we're going along, and this guy, Matt, you can talk a little bit on a rebreather to other people underwater.
Okay.
You can't have a conversation like this, but you can kind of talk.
Right.
So we get to a certain point in the dive, and Matt comes back to the team, and he says, it's blocked. So basically, again, we were going to do this one-way traverse through the wreck. And call it halfway through that traverse, it turns out that at some point, because he hadn't done this dive in maybe, call it 2-3 years, whatever it was, at some point, whatever it was had collapsed.
Oh.
So we're kind of like sitting there,
Okay.
and we know we've stirred up a lot of silt behind us.
Yeah.
The visibility, and this is not an exaggeration, I have a little thing that's like right here that shows all my dive information.
That's kinda
And I could barely see it.
Okay.
I could not,
Like right
my
in front of your
hand right
face.
here, I could not see.
Uh-huh.
So,
That's not good.
so at that point, we tie in a line. We should have tied one in earlier. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we tie in a line, and all four of us go trudging back through the wreck to try to find our original entrance. And so we're stirring up more silt, obviously. There's nothing you can do. I don't care how good a diver you are. You're going to stir up silt in a wreck like that. So we start searching around, and we get to a point where we're like, okay, we can't find it. What are we going to do? So we reel the reel back, and we go to this point where we tied it in. And that big, long, flat line there in the middle is about 90 minutes long.
Oh.
So what we decided to do is instead of all of us going and looking around the wreck, we would send Matt with the reel to see if he could find the entrance, because he was most familiar with this wreck. So the three of us are sitting there, and then we start to hear like bang, 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 bang. So we bang, bang, bang back. Now, one of the things we had done that was a good thing to do is we had told people on the boat, like, our run time will be 2 hours. So we'll be back in 2 hours. When they didn't see us back in 2 hours, we knew they would come looking for us.
Right.
So about the 2 hour mark, we start hearing banging, and then it goes away. Matt is gone. Matt comes back. He can't find something. He goes, I'm going to go try again. Matt goes off again. And we start hearing more banging. And Matt comes back. And he says, he writes, we have a slate, so he writes on the slate, he says, I found the entrance, it collapsed as I was leaving. So now our path out, the original path out is collapsed, and the original entrance is collapsed.
Okay.
So all four of us are back, we're all sitting where that straight line is, we're just sitting there. And so Matt says, okay, I'm gonna go try again to find a different way out of the wreck. So he's gone for a period of time. And like I said, we were literally sitting there for 90 minutes, doing nothing. And it's about, at that spot, it's called 100 feet deep
Okay.
inside the wreck. So obviously, if we weren't on rebreathers, we'd be dead. There's like zero doubt about that.
Right.
So, you know, we're all calm. I mean, we're, you know, I'll call it worried, but not panicked. So we're asking each other, how much oxygen do you have? How much scrubber time, the stuff that gets rid of carbon dioxide, how much scrubber time do you have left? And we're communicating with each other and making sure everybody's okay. But after a while, Matt doesn't come back. And we're like, okay, we got to go find Matt. Like, we can't just sit here. We're starting to run low on oxygen. And I mean, we have time, but like it's, you know, it's looking pretty grim.
Mm-hmm.
So we start following the line, and when you're in a situation like this, you never let go of the line. I don't care how bad things get. Like, I don't, you know, if you're doing contortions, you never let go of that line. You basically put like an okay sign around the line, and you never let go of it, because literally, if you let go of the line, you will never find it again. I mean, you might bump into it if you're lucky, but visibility, and like I said, it's not an exaggeration, visibility is measured in millimeters.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So we all follow the line, and we start, you could see at the end of that line, that flat line, there's a line that starts to go up. And what happened was Matt was kind of going up into the, now the ship's upside down, so it was the hull. So Matt starts going up into the hull. And as we go up there, the visibility gets vastly better because all the sediment is kind of down below.
Right.
So we get up into the hull, and we can see Matt off in the distance. He's got the reel with him, and he's got his extra, that bailout tank.
Oh. Hang on.
Oh, hang on.
This is just
Is it
like,
back?
this
Okay.
is just like a malfunction under the water.
Yeah, exactly.
Fine,
Like,
don't panic.
Don't panic. Be calm.
All right.
So, so we find Matt, and Matt is up there, and I see Matt banging his tank into the side of the ship, and my heart just sank. And I thought, like, okay, wait a second. Like, the banging was not the people on the outside of the ship trying to find us. The banging was Matt on the inside of the ship. So the four of us are sitting there, and you can see that flat line kind of like that's a bit shallower in the white. We're sitting there, we're trying to figure out what to do. And like I said, I mean, it was, my wife is here, so I don't want to get too graphic, but it was pretty grim. My wife knows all about this, by the way, so it's not a surprise. But so anyway, so we're really like starting to wonder, like, okay, we know they're going to look for us. I know the other people on this dive, and they're not going to just leave us for sure. But like, how are they going to find us? I mean, we're in the middle of this wreck. They know approximately where we are. That's one of the benefits of banging the tank, is they kind of know where we are.
But the entrance is collapsed.
But it's collapsed. I mean, the entrance is collapsed. The people who are going to come find us have never been in this part of the wreck in their entire life.
Right.
And we can't find our way out, right? So I'm thinking, like, you know, I'm literally going to die inside this tin can. And so we come up with another plan, and the plan is, like, my friend John and I are going to stay at the end of that line, and we're going to continue to bang the tank against the hull so they know we're alive and we're inside. And then Matt and this other guy, Aaron, are each going to take their own line. They're going to tie onto the master line, or what we call the main line. They're going to tie into the main line, and they're going to go each see if they can find a different way out of the wreck.
Okay.
So I'm sitting with my friend John, who I've known for quite some time, and we're just kind of like, oof, this is not good. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, what are we going to do? You know, like, this is a grim situation. So I'm just contemplating all that, and then all of a sudden I kind of see in the distance a light coming towards me. And I know it's not Aaron, because I can kind of see him off in the corner of my eyes, still tying in or doing something. Matt has gone. And I know what their lights look like anyway. And I know it's not John, because John is next to me. And this guy emerges from the silt, and he's got an orange dry suit on. And there was only one guy in the boat wearing an orange dry suit. His name is Auntie. And I see his light coming towards me, and I thought, oh my God. So Auntie comes towards me, and one of the first things you do when you find somebody in this situation is you make sure they're calm, because people who are panicked underwater tend to grab regulators and all this other stuff. So he looks at me, and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." And he says, "Okay," and he basically says, he points me to his line, because he had basically, I'll tell you how he did this in a minute. He had come into the wreck, and he had found our line. He didn't find us, he found our line.
Sure.
So he basically followed our line and was running his own line. He had started a line from outside the wreck. So he basically said, take my line, don't let go of it, and go. So I go down his line, and that's where you can see that section going down. After it's flat, up, sitting there waiting, and then going down. So I start going down, and I get to this one section in his line, and it goes underneath something a little bit higher than this table, maybe like that high. Okay. And his line goes underneath it. And there's all kinds of silt and dirt and stuff underneath this thing. And I thought to myself, like, why did Auntie run his line underneath this thing? Like, I thought it was like a beam. Right. Like, why didn't he just go over it? So I go over it, and I bang my head into the bulkhead. So it turns out it was a bulkhead.
That'd be why.
And I'm like, I got to get under that? Like, there's just no way. I mean, I'm looking at it, but then I think, like, Auntie, he dives a rebreather called a JJ. But it's got a higher profile than mine. So I'm like, well, if Auntie can get in, there's got to be a way I can get out. So I take off my bailout tank, and I push it through. And I take off my camera, and I push it through. And I start trying to get underneath it. And I, you know, I'm literally banging into the metal, and I can't get underneath it. And I'm not panicked, but I'm like, how am I going to get out? I've gotten this far. Like, how am I going to get outside this stupid wreck? So I literally start, like, pushing away the silt and the sand to get underneath this obstruction. And all of a sudden, like, I kind of get like halfway maybe, and I feel somebody grab my arm. This guy's name is James Straker. He's a cave diver from Florida. He grabs my hand, and he says, I got you. We'll get you out. Don't worry. So he takes me, this is no joke, my rebreather has a metal bar on top of it. He takes this thing, and he starts doing this. He's literally whipping me up and down and, like, shaking me side to side, and I've got my rebreather mouthpiece in my mouth, and I'm trying to hold this thing in so that I don't spit it out and flood my rebreather, because then I'm in really big trouble, right? So my head is, like, literally in the sand, and he's pulling me out of the wreck, or out of this obstruction. So finally he actually gets me out. And I gather up my bailout and I gather up my camera and I continue to follow Auntie's line, and there's a bunch of silt and stuff in there, and I can't even tell where the edge of the ship is. I mean, it's not bad. Even outside I'll call it the inner portion, there's this other area that's kind of like an open area that goes to where we came in. So anyway, so I finally got out, and there was some other guys waiting for me to make sure I was okay, and then I did about, I don't know, 2 hours of decompression or whatever it was. So it ended up being like a 5.5 hour dive in total.
Wow.
What happened on the surface was they realized that we weren't back at 2 hours. They didn't see us on the decompression line. They sent a safety diver in to see if they could see us. They thought maybe they were just somewhere else on the wreck and running late. And the safety diver heard the banging.
Okay.
So the safety diver, she alerted the people on the boat that we were inside the wreck. There was at least one person alive inside the wreck. And so they basically hatched a rescue plan, and this guy, Auntie, literally got extremely lucky. He just started poking around and diving by braille, as we call it. Found a way in to the wreck, started searching around, just feeling, hoping he would find somebody or something, and found our line, and basically rescued us. So, you know, we did a lot of things right. We told him how long we would be there. We told him where we would be. We didn't panic. We stayed together as a team, other than Matt going off on his own, but that was wise to do that, and he was on the end of a line so we could find him. So we did a lot of things right. We banged to let him know we were alive. Our biggest mistake was obviously not tying in a line. You know, we're all four of the guys on that dive were very experienced divers. You know, the mistake I made personally was I went on what we call a trust me dive. I trusted that Matt knew his way.
Yeah.
I trusted that he would get us out. I mean, it is a one-way traverse. So if you lay a line on a one-way traverse, you basically have two choices. Either you go back through it to pick your line up, or you cut your line and leave it. We could have done that, but we didn't, so we didn't put in a line, and that was obviously our biggest mistake. And just trusting Matt. I mean, not that he had anything bad, but I mean,
Sure.
You know, trust me dives are dangerous for anybody who's a diver in the audience. Don't do a trust me dive. And, you know, like I said, it's not Matt's fault. Any one of the four of us could have aborted the dive or said, like, hey, we need to put in a line, and,
Sure.
and we didn't. So, you know, quite frankly, we are lucky to be alive. I mean, lucky and fortunate, but it was a crazy experience for sure.
And I feel like, to your point, you know, it just reinforces like the value of teamwork. You need a team. If you hadn't had that team with
absolutely.
you, you wouldn't be here right now.
No, for sure not. And you know, I don't do dives like this with people I don't know and trust.
Sure.
I mean, that's just kind of the way it goes. So anyway.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for those incredible stories, and thank you for the bonus story as well. What an incredible story. If you got a few more minutes, I know we could take some questions from the audience. I'm sure folks would love to ask you some stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to take the first question. Lance Miller, 1222. On your decompression, do you ever stage tanks at your decompression levels so that you don't have to take them down with you, but you come back up and they're sitting there waiting for you?
Yeah, so it's a good question. The answer is yes and no. I stage, like I said, normally on a dive like that, you would take 4 tanks. We also do something called team bailout, where people take different gases and you stay together as a team. So if you need a gas, somebody has it on the team. I staged, I had the safety diver stage it for me. I staged a tank of 50% oxygen at 70 feet deep. The downside of doing that is if you do get caught in current, or for whatever reason you do not get back to the downline where you stage it, you don't have that gas. And if you're relying on that gas for your decompression, you have a big problem. So if you stage gas, I would recommend that you, in addition to staging gas, do team gas, where everybody has at least some of the gas you're going to need to do at least one diver. Kind of the rule is if you have 3 divers, make sure 2 can have failures, complete failures, and get to the surface with the gas you carry. But yes, you do stage tanks sometimes.
David, 1199. My question is full face mask regulator versus gripping it in your teeth for 5 hours. When I stopped doing this, guys were saying full face will keep you alive, and you can have a seizure and do things like vomit and still not die. Do you have an opinion there?
Yeah, so there's a problem with full face masks on rebreathers in particular. Open circuit, it's a different story. With rebreathers, because you're constantly breathing out, if you tend to breathe out and you don't grip a mouthpiece and make sure that air or that gas that you're breathing out goes through the rebreather, it's not going to get scrubbed to carbon dioxide. So there have been cases where people dive full face mask with a rebreather and get carbon dioxide buildup inside their full face mask and pass out. I wear a gag strap on my rebreather to keep my, what's called a DSV or dive surface valve in my mouth. So theoretically, even if I passed out, that thing would stick in my mouth. And it also makes it easier. You don't have to kind of like grip as hard for 5.5 hours.
Hi. Thank you for your talk, Brett.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for coming. I'm Stu, 1168. You recently found more wrecks very locally. Is that correct, off of Point Magoo? Could you briefly mention those?
Yeah, sure. So there's another guy, give credit where credit's due. There's another guy, Tyler Stalter, who I do a lot of diving with. He's based in San Diego. I'm going to dive with him tomorrow. He does a lot of research, and we work as a team. And Tyler does a lot of what's called bathymetry research, where bathymetry is mapping of ocean floors, and he looks for anomalies. And there's not a lot of diving or research, at least that I know of, that I'm aware of, lot being like there's been in Southern California, up in Oxnard. So Tyler got a hold of some bathymetry data in Oxnard, and there's a guy we know up there. His name is Danny Graham. He's another Southern California diver, and he has a boat called the Triton. And so we decided to start doing some more wreck exploration up there. The first two things we found, the first one was a Hellcat. We're pretty sure it's a Hellcat. We're about like, call it 90% sure. So we found an airplane which looks to be a Hellcat. And then the second one we found was a dredge. We just found it right before I left for the Solomons. So the beginning of February, we found a dredge that was being used. It was being moved from Long Beach to Morro Bay. And we identified it as a dredge based on the machine we saw on it. And then we found some newspaper articles with the location that matched where we found it, so we were able to identify the specific dredge that it was. We've got probably at least half a dozen other targets up there that we've looked at with sonar on Danny's boat, and we just need to schedule time to go up there. So we know there's a lot more wrecks. I mean, there's Point Magoo Naval Air Station up there, so it makes sense that there's a lot of Navy wrecks. There's 2 or 3 in particular we know are out there. We're just trying to find them.
Hey, Brett. Nick Eubank. A little bit for those who may not know about technical diving. For a trip out to the Britannic, how much did you spend on your helium bill?
So it's a good question. Helium is pretty expensive. In the United States, it's not too bad. It's like $2. Well, I get it for about $2 a cubic foot. So like an average dive I do in Southern California will cost me like, just call it $5 for easy math for people in the room. My entire helium bill, now we had to pay for some of our gas that went in bailout, even though we didn't use it. So my entire helium bill was probably on the order of, I don't know, like $200 or $300 on a rebreather. Oh. On open circuit, if I would have done the same amount of diving on open circuit, it would have been $2,000 or $3,000.
Yeah, that's
just to give you an idea. Yeah. Rebreathers are way, way, way more efficient. And helium is not cheap.
This is not a brand deal for rebreathers, folks. We just,
yeah, I don't make any money selling rebreathers. I don't sell that stuff.
We just do adventure.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Trent. I saw in your initial dive profile, the Britannic, you went about 60 to 70 feet per minute is what you mentioned on your descent, and I was just wondering what was your equalizing process, because that seemed like a very fluid motion to the bottom.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm fortunate. I mean, my left ear sometimes has problems, especially when I'm doing repetitive diving, but I can generally equalize without touching my ears. I can just click my jaw and equalize. And not have to stop and do this, because you're right. I mean, you got a hand on a scooter, you might be trying to protect a camera, so you might, but I'm also like inflating my dry suit. So one hand on the scooter, inflating a dry suit, adding diluent to my rebreather, adding a little bit of oxygen, so you don't have a lot of free hands. So yeah, you either stop and clear, or you find a way to do it without doing it. So I can usually clear without like just clicking my jaw. But it's a pretty fast descent for sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Brett. You described, I think maybe it was George, as a phenomenal diver, and yes. I'm just curious, what for you makes someone a phenomenal diver?
Poise. The guy, he took all 4 tanks with him and handled them with ease. He was absolutely in what we call perfect trim the entire dive. So he was perfectly horizontal. No matter where we were on the wreck, no matter what we were doing, he was perfectly horizontal. His buoyancy was perfect. You could just tell, like, and he dives for a living. This is, he's, so yeah, I would just say poise underwater, just general attitude, confidence, and just his ability to position himself in the water perfectly, like no matter what. And experience. I mean, he's done a ton of diving on the Britannic.
And if that's all the questions we have from the audience, thank you, Brett, for the interesting and informative program. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us tonight. And for the folks at home, if you liked what you saw here tonight, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps us out a ton. And if you're in LA, why not come on by? We do this every single week, and you can ask your questions from our live audience and meet our amazing speakers yourself. That's going to do it for us here at the Adventurers Club. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time off the beaten path. Good night.